There does seem to be a distinctive kind of problem in our system where Australian industry is not partnering in the same way that Australian public sector or community sector partners are. There's a big upward trend in collaboration between Australian universities and global companies, but Australian university collaboration with Australian companies has been really flat for more than 20 years.
Hello, and welcome to the Partnerships podcast series by UIIN. I'm Sarah Jabber, Director at UIIN, and your host for today. In this episode, I speak with Paul Harris, Executive Director of Australia's Innovative Research Universities Network. We dive into what 25 years of data tells us about university-industry collaboration and challenging some of the long-held myths around innovation. We explore the role of industry, data collection, and the importance of finding the right metrics for measuring engagement. If you're interested in research and innovation, whether in Australia or beyond, tune into the conversation.
Very happy to be here today to be joined by someone whose work challenges some of the dominant narratives around university-industry collaboration, especially in Australia. I'm joined by Paul Harris, who's the Executive Director of the Innovative Research Universities IRU network and is a policy thinker who has worked at the intersection of diplomacy, science, and higher education for many years. In today's conversation, we're going to explore what the data tells us about collaboration performance and how that compares to some of the assumptions that have been prevalent across the higher education landscape in Australia. We're going to touch on the role of industry, absorptive capacity, the importance of incentives and internal culture, and what universities and systems can do to create more meaningful, equitable, and impactful partnerships. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Sarah. Great to be with you. And good morning to European colleagues. I know it's early, but it's late afternoon here in Canberra in Australia, and it's good to be talking with you.
Thank you, Paul. Maybe to start off, could you tell us a little bit around IRU and a bit around the role that the network plays within the higher education and innovation landscape in Australia?
Yeah, definitely. So we're a group of 7 young research universities in Australia, established going back to the sort of early 1970s as our system was expanding in Australia and new universities were being created. So really, I think about the universities in our group as universities that were established as communities and our education system grew, and they're really about opening up the benefits of higher education and research and innovation to more communities. So we have a strong commitment to expanding access to higher education and also to research and research translation and impact that really delivers benefit for our communities. So as a group, I think we primarily do 2 things. We foster collaboration among the universities in our network, and then we work really constructively and collaboratively with government to try and bring the voice of our member universities into policy discussions here in Canberra.
Great, thank you. And you recently wrote a piece that I've talked to you about previously around Australian industry not playing ball in R&D collaboration. You looked at data over the last 25 years and aimed to challenge some of those notions of Australia is really good at research, but not so good at innovation. Firstly, I'm curious what triggered you to undertake that analysis, and can you tell us a little bit around some of your findings, especially around the current state of university industry collaboration in Australia?
Yeah, happy to. And I should credit my colleague Cameron Naylan, who's really the expert on open research data in Australia and now working in Europe as well. Cameron is the brains behind a lot of the research data that we're using. So we were prompted to write the article because there has been in Australia this persistent kind of story about our universities being really good at research, particularly fundamental research, but hopeless at collaborating with industry and commercializing. And we talk a lot here, as I'm sure colleagues in other countries do, about the valley of death and how bad we are at innovation. And we had, under our previous federal government a few years ago, we had a really big package of new policy and funding that was focused on university research commercialization. And the framing of that whole kind of policy was really about the fact that we had a sort of commercialization and innovation problem in Australia, and that really the problem lay with universities. And then we're now in the middle of we have a new government, a new Labor government. We're in the middle of a big, what's called a strategic examination of our R&D system. So really the biggest review of our research and innovation system in Australia that we've had for at least 15 years. And this review process is repeating a lot of the same kind of narrative about we're really good at research, we're really terrible at collaboration and commercialization. And so Cameron and I thought, well, we should go and look at the evidence and the data and see what it tells us. And to cut a long story short, what it tells us is that research output from the the Australian system and from universities has really expanded, like more than doubled over the last 15 years. And while that's been happening, we've seen an increase in quality, we've seen an increase in research productivity, and we've seen a huge increase in collaboration. So if you just use the publication data as one set, collaboration between universities and private sector partners has more than tripled over the last 10 or 15 years. It's more than doubled with public sector partners. So there's a weird disconnect between the sort of policy narrative and the actual data, which shows that universities are collaborating more and more with industry partners in Australia.
Interesting. And I'm always curious, why does that kind of narrative stick? Is it just maybe, yeah, not having really analyzed the data so thoroughly, or what do you think kind of leads to keeping that narrative going?
Yeah, I guess I would attempt to answer that in three ways. Firstly, I think the data is a problem. Like, I think it was, even with Cameron's expertise, it was hard for us to pull some of this data together. So we looked at publications, we looked at research income, we looked at company data, we looked at all sorts of different things. But it is challenging to pull all that together and put a coherent picture together. We don't have a national R&D agency. We don't really have coordinated national R&D data or reporting. So that does make it hard. I think sometimes too, you could say that there's a kind of political agenda, like it suits a government or perhaps people in some parts of industry to say, if we do have a problem, the problem is in the universities. And then thirdly, I think working with a group of universities who are really committed to applied research and research translation, we think a lot about research impact and pathways to research impact. And I think we don't do ourselves any favors in the way we talk about research impact. We either say it's really simplistic and we're just going to measure it in crude economic terms, when everybody knows that the impacts of publicly funded research spill out much more broadly in society. It's not just a dollar return. But then on the other side, sometimes we say the problem with impact is it's too complicated and it's impossible to measure, so we couldn't possibly measure it. Whereas I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. We know it's not just a simplistic dollar return on investment, but we also could do a lot more to improve the way that we talk about impact and we evidence impact. So I think sometimes we don't help ourselves by either saying it's too simple or it's too complicated.
It's a really interesting point you bring up, because in our work as well, we've really seen that research impact, but also external engagement impact is just very difficult to track, to monitor. And part of it could be, how do you define the right indicators? And I think that's another challenge as well. If you have a certain metrics that you need to report on, then that could also influence the activities, rather than sometimes thinking about what do we actually want to achieve and then thinking about how to measure that. So I think there's a challenge there as well from a policy perspective, to make sure that you're not then just reporting for the sake of reporting and then also skewing narrative.
Yeah. And in Australia, we did have a kind of national framework for assessing research engagement and impact in universities. And a lot of us worked on that over many years, and it had some problems, as you're rightly outlining. But then the government stopped that, and we don't have anything in its place. And I think, at least from our point of view, we would rather have something and keep improving it instead of having nothing. I think it is important that it's good for universities, I think, to keep working on improving the evidence. And you're right, it's going to look different in different places. It's going to look different for different kinds of research, but there's still a lot we could be doing to improve the evidence about the ways in which university research is used by partners in the private sector or the public sector or in communities. And I think there is a lot we could do to improve that picture.
Yeah. What about looking a little bit at the industry side? So in your piece, you showed that collaboration is increasing with companies, but more so with international companies than Australian ones. I'm curious, what does that mean about, or does that say something about the landscape of companies in Australia that, it's mostly small to medium-sized enterprises? Or what do you think it means? And you also talked about absorptive capacity, so maybe you can expand on that a little.
We saw this really interesting trend in the data, which was increasing levels of collaboration across all sectors. But if we look at public sector and government collaboration, there's a sort of upward trend in collaboration with global partners, and there's an upward trend in collaboration with Australian government partners. But then when we look at industry, there's a big upward trend in collaboration between Australian universities and global companies. But Australian university collaboration with Australian companies has been really flat for more than 20 years. And we do think that there are well-observed challenges in the private sector in Australia in terms of investing in research. We're still seeing, if we look at research contracts and research funding, we're still seeing increasing funding coming from Australian companies to universities. So there is increasing collaboration, and we would be the first to admit that not all collaboration is going to be expressed in a publication. Like there's many different forms of partnering. But there does seem to be a distinctive kind of problem in our system where Australian industry is not partnering in the same way that Australian public sector or community sector partners are. And we think that is something about the structure of the industry, but also, Australian company investment in R&D over the last couple of decades has been pretty flat. And we're starting to see some increases now in Australian companies investing in sort of fundamental research. And we're seeing some companies like Atlassian and CSR actually publishing more and developing a real research profile in their kind of areas of interest. But I think it has been a broader problem across the Australian kind of sector. And the government is looking at that as part of this R&D review. But I think we have to be careful that we don't just try and adopt kind of models from other countries, because I think we do have a unique sort of industry structure. We have a unique research system, and we need to think about how do we help bridge some of those gaps.
Great. Maybe as because that review is still ongoing and the outcomes haven't come out yet, but maybe I'd be curious to hear from your perspective. What do you think? What kind of policy or funding reforms could help support more of that strategic, longer term engagement between universities and external partners?
Well, we've seen, as in any country, I think there's a number of existing programs that are actually doing really good things that could be scaled up and further built upon. So we have in Australia this new industry PhD program, which we think is working really well. I think our industry partners think it's working really well. When we say industry PhDs in Australia, we don't mean just private sector. We mean collaboration between universities and any external partner to give our PhD students the opportunity to spend time working with partners, but also give people from those organizations opportunities to come in and do a PhD. So things like that, I think, are working well and should be scaled up. I think one of the big questions here is going to be the sort of proliferation of government programs that we have for supporting translation and commercialisation. I think there'll be some consolidation and there'll be some focusing of those programs. I think there will have to be some kind of reform of the R&D tax incentives that the government offers to companies. That is the biggest single chunk of the Australian government R&D budget. And I think there have been a number of studies looking at how that could be reformed, including things like giving companies an incentive to get involved in supporting PhDs and the future kind of R&D workforce. And I think we are going to need some national coordination. We don't have like a UKRI or a Tri-Council or one of those bodies that kind of is charged with looking at the system as a system and thinking about how the system operates together. And I think we will need some kind of national coordinating body that can improve the data and think about, okay, do we have the right matching of capabilities in the research system in the universities with some of the sort of priority industry sectors for the country? So I think we will see some big reforms, and we're just working through at the moment with government what that will actually look like over the next few months.
Yeah, interesting times. And I guess another challenge as well is some of the outcomes can take a really long time to manifest. So even to review a program or to determine has this been a good investment or not can also be quite difficult to measure. What about from the university side? We always talk about, oh, what can universities do differently? But I'm curious to hear from your perspective. We talk a lot around structures and systems and processes that can enable and support external engagement. Have you seen or have you thought about what can universities be doing differently in terms of maybe incentives, governance, culture to drive more external engagement?
I think two things. I think in the universities that I work with, we already have there's a strong applied research culture. Many of our universities have existing kind of pathways to impact programs to support their staff and their students to think early about partnering and collaborating and innovation. I think we would like to see that kind of rolled out more broadly across the whole sector. And we would like to see, I think government agencies and funding agencies can do a lot to support a culture of translation and innovation, rather not just evaluating it after it's happened, but actually encouraging and incentivizing it. So we're very keen to see, I think there's things that we can do as universities to help build that culture and that discussion with the funding bodies and with government. I think the other big question for Australian universities is this question which we're seeing play out in the UK system as well, about specialisation and focus. And we have in Australia, we have public universities. They're quite large by international standards. They're all comprehensive. We don't have the sort of small, targeted kind of Caltech type institutions. And there's been a lot of discussion here about what are the pros and cons of having really big comprehensive universities, and whether we could start to see some kind of focusing and specializing and incentives for universities to say, we're not going to try and do everything, but we're going to focus on this particular area. So there's a really interesting discussion here at the moment, I think, about a clearer focus on like regional or place-based innovation ecosystems and the roles of different universities in supporting those. And I think we're really supportive of that. Like we would like to see a national system where universities were supported and encouraged to focus on their strengths and not try and do everything. And the government has also announced that it's going to introduce this new approach to mission-based compacts with each university. And so we're working at the moment with the government on what that might look like and how could the research mission of the university be captured in this mission-based compact agreement. So we'll see. I think there is a lot of reform happening at a sort of policy level, but I think there are things that universities can do to help this process along as well.
Yeah, it sounds like a really, I guess, a lot of challenges, but also a lot of exciting changes potentially. And with that, what you said around all being comprehensive universities, all more or less trying to do similar things, I guess part of that has also been the international student focus, which I think now with, again, changes in policies around that can mean that universities don't need to be chasing that. So you're not so fixated maybe on rankings, and you can focus more on, I don't know, maybe regional development or other things or other areas where the university can play a role.
Yeah. And I think one of the strengths of the Australian system is that over the last 20 or 30 years, we successfully created one of the most internationalized university systems in the world. Australia is a small country population-wise. We only have about 40 universities, but we have very high levels of international students and also international research collaboration. But I think the world is changing. There is some of that success in collaborating with international companies and not so much with Australian companies was the product of a time where successive Australian governments thought that we should be the most open trading economy we could be. And I think what we're seeing now is more of a focus around the world on sovereign capabilities and security. And I think that is driving more of a discussion about yes, we still want to be internationalized. We still want to be tapping into talent and knowledge around the world, but we need to be more conscious of kind of building and maintaining those sovereign capabilities at the same time.
Do you want to be a part of a global community where universities, businesses, and public organizations come together to solve the world's biggest challenges? At UIIN, we equip our members with the skills, tools, and strategies they need to create impactful partnerships that drive real-world change. Whether it's upskilling your team, strengthening your institution's partnership efforts, or becoming more entrepreneurial, UIIN empowers you with the knowledge and support you need. Join us today. Visit uiin.org to find the best plan for your organization.
Paul, I'd like to go back a little bit to the topic of impact. So in your analysis, you looked at, of course, co-publications, which is one indicator of or measure of engagement. And we kind of touched on it a bit at the beginning, how almost this balance between how do you measure and report on collaboration, on impact, but at the same time, how do you then reduce that it just becomes maybe a numbers game? And we also talked about, and it's a theme we've been really looking at, is value-driven collaboration. How do you think about the maybe beyond economic outcomes, inclusive outcomes? So how can you also be an inclusive higher education system? I'm just wondering if you have thoughts around that. How can you reduce that danger that we just focus on numbers and metrics and look more at the broader impact that our work is having?
Yeah, and it's a really good question, and we think about it a lot in the IRU group of universities that I work with because our universities were founded with this kind of commitment to access and equity and, delivering benefit for the community. And that is not just about teaching students, it's about research and knowledge translation as well. I think this is part of the risk with thinking too narrowly about impact is that we sort of fall into this pattern of thinking that we have to define everything in economic terms or commercial terms. We say, well, every dollar that you put in to research, you get X dollars out. And we're narrowing the scope of the conversation. And I think one of the things we've learned over the last few years globally is that it's not enough to just think about the kind of simplistic dollar in, dollar out. We also have to think about the distributional impacts. Who is benefiting? Are there communities that are being left behind? We need to really be attentive to the impact that's being created from our research. And we know there's lots of impact. There's lots of different evidence points for that. But we have to be a bit more conscious, I think, of the distributional impacts. And I think we have to be able to talk about benefits that go beyond commercial benefits. Of course, they're very important, and the private sector powers the innovation system, and we have to be able to talk about that. In Australia, for example, the fastest growing sector of our economy is the care economy. And we have lots of research partnerships with health system, aged care system, government agencies. And that kind of collaboration, even though it might not have an immediate commercial patentable outcome, could lead to huge economic and social benefit for the country down the track. So I think we need to think about like where are those big important sectors of our economy and society and in the private sector and the public sector, and then think about the role of research and knowledge in helping to improve practice and delivery in those sectors. So, yes, we need to be thinking about like critical minerals and we do that, but we also need to be thinking about how are we showing the impact of our work in some of those other sectors as well.
Yeah. In terms of a lot of the issues we've been talking about are quite unique to Australia. Australia in general has a very unique landscape and ecosystem. But I'm curious as well, what lessons or practices that you've come across and that we've been talking about today, do you think maybe are transferable internationally and which are really shaped and defined by the Australian context?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, one thing that I think we're experiencing in Australia, which might be relevant for other contexts, is, we have had this kind of fairly free market approach to universities and international education and research. And we've seen this huge growth in research output and research productivity over the last couple of decades. But I think there's a sense in which the research effort in universities has grown so quickly and it's been increasingly funded from revenue that universities are bringing in themselves. And there is a bit of a disconnect then, I think, from the university research effort and the kind of government level national priorities. And there is a really legitimate questioning by government about, are you doing research in the areas that are important to the government and to industry and the community, or are you just doing the research that you want to do? And so I think we have to, as our university research system has grown, we have to make sure that we can show that connection back to priorities of the country and the government. And then I guess one thing that I'm keen to look at in other jurisdictions is, like, I think it is possible for a country to get too focused on commercialization and applied research and kind of neglect to invest in fundamental research and basic research. And I think you can look at recent government reviews in places like Taiwan and see that it is perhaps possible to be too focused on commercialization. So how do we get that balance right? And how do we learn from other parts of the world about how they think about their system as a holistic system, and how do they make sure they've got the right balance of different kinds of research and different capabilities?
I think that's a great term, looking at it as a holistic system. You need all the various parts to make that system impactful and relevant for different contexts and different stakeholders. Paul, I started this conversation looking at the piece you've done. So you looked at the last 25 years. Maybe we can look ahead to the next 25 years, maybe at least the next 10 years. As we look ahead, what big shifts, maybe technological, economical, policy driven, do you think will shape or reshape how collaboration will take place in the future?
Yeah, good question. We've just had our annual conference here in Australia in the last couple of weeks, and we had a big focus on AI. I know everyone is talking about AI. It's very hard to think about something original or interesting that you can say about AI. But one thing we as a group, we're working on a research roadmap to think about how AI is changing the kind of research management and support in our universities. But the thing that really struck me, we had a colleague from Microsoft Research come and speak to us from the US. And, Microsoft is partnering with universities in a whole range of different ways, and they're very keen to collaborate more effectively with universities. But the other thing that he was saying is we really need universities to keep doing fundamental research. Otherwise, these AI models that we're running are just going to run out of steam. And we also really need universities to produce a range of graduates. Like, I think Microsoft, the thing they really are trying to hire for at the moment more than anything else is like critical thinking and creative arts kind of backgrounds, which was interesting. So I think we do need to keep up with the pace of technological change. We need to show that we're offering education that's relevant for students who are going to be going out into a workplace where these AI tools are being used. But we also need to preserve something foundational about deep knowledge and critical thinking and creative thinking. And actually, what's really interesting is that our colleagues in these big companies are saying to us that's actually the most important thing for us at the moment. So it was a really good conversation with Microsoft here recently, and I think it's been really helpful for us thinking about how do we move forward with some of these new technologies as well.
That's a really good point, and I guess a nice point to end our conversation on. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. It's been really interesting to hear your perspectives and also just challenge the system a little bit. And I'm really curious to see how things develop over the next few years, especially from a policy perspective.
Thank you. And yeah, looking forward to having some of your colleagues here in Western Australia later in the year.
Yes, same. We're heading over to Perth end of November for a forum together with Murdoch University on value-driven collaboration. We'll be continuing and expanding on some of the discussions had today. So look forward to being there and having those conversations. Paul, I wish you a great rest of your afternoon and evening, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to today's discussion. Follow UIIN on LinkedIn. And if you're enjoying our podcast, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review in your podcast platform of choice to help other people find this content too.